Hello, everyone. Welcome to our show, Racial and Social Justice Beyond the Dome. Thank you for joining. I'm your host, Dan Yu, with the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh, here with Carrie Boehner, the president of the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh. Before we get started, let me run through a couple of housekeeping items so everyone is up to speed on how to use the Zoom webinar features. Everyone has been muted upon entry to allow for clean and clear audio. Today's format will be a little different from previous shows. Our guest, Sonnie Hereford IV, will give us a presentation which should take about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will do Q&A. We do welcome your questions and comments. You can ask questions during the presentation using the Q&A feature, and we'll get to them right after his presentation. So at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is the Q&A button. And click on that, and you'll be able to type in your question or comment into the Q&A box, and then click send. Carrie and I will be monitoring these throughout the webcast, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. If you have any technical questions, you can use the same Q&A window to communicate with Carrie directly, and we'll do our best to assist you. As a reminder, this show is being recorded. So today, we welcome one of the true civil rights heroes, Sonnie Hereford IV, Notre Dame class of 1979. It is such an honor to have you on our show. Thank you, Sonnie, for being here.
Thanks, Sonny.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Now, you have an interesting connection with Pittsburgh, and we're the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh. It's such a great story, and I'd love for the audience to hear it.
Okay. All right. Well, so when I was at Notre Dame, and I guess this was 77, I was there from 75 through 79, but I was actually, and I hate to admit this, at Notre Dame, but I was living with my girlfriend, and we decided to get married so that we could get Notre Dame football tickets together. so we got married, and the first game that year was at Pittsburgh, and so we actually drove to Pittsburgh for our honeymoon from Notre Dame.
So you went to Pittsburgh for your honeymoon.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep. And it was wonderful, by the way.
And Notre Dame won the game, right? So that's a plus.
And Pitt was the defending national champion, and we beat them that year.
And didn't they have Tony Dorsett, right? The All-Pro, right?
He was there in 76. I'm not sure he was.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure we would have beaten them if he had been on the team in 77.
Gotcha. All right. Well, Sonnie, thank you so much, and take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let's see. Let me share my screen. Okay, I hope everyone is seeing that young man. That young man is my father when he was about 6 years old. And the civil rights story of our family begins with what my father had to endure when he was a child growing up here in Madison County, Alabama, because that really formed his thinking that he wanted to make sure that his children did not have to go through the same things that he had to go through. And before I get into more details of the story, I would just like to say I've had the opportunity to speak at a lot of schools, even a few. Let's say I've spoken at Notre Dame, I've spoken at Ohio State, at University of Alabama at Huntsville, and Winona State University in southern Minnesota, because I have a friend who I went to school with at Notre Dame who is now a professor at Winona State. He has invited me up. But I also speak to high school children and children much younger. There's a Montessori school here in Huntsville, and I have spoken there, I think 22 out of the last 23 years. And those children, 5 and 6, some of them are as young as 5 and 6, they don't understand things like prejudice or bigotry, but they have a basic understanding of being fair or being unfair, being mean or being nice. And so when I'm speaking to children that young, I'll usually start out with a story something like this. I'll say, how many of you like ice cream? How many of you like to play video games? And then I'll ask them, how many of you have blue eyes? How many of you have brown eyes? And then I'll say, now, what would you think about this? What if you came into school in the morning and your teacher said, those of you with blue eyes, we're going to go over to this other room and we're going to play video games and eat ice cream and cake. But if you have brown eyes, you have to stay here and do your schoolwork. And I always say, now, would that be fair? And every child, every time, always says, no, that would not be fair. And there are a couple of interesting things about that to me. Number one, even the kids with the blue eyes say that would not be fair. So they understand that even though that scenario would benefit them, that it would not be fair to the other children. The other thing that's interesting to me about that is that if I can get them to understand that it's not fair to treat people differently because of the color of their eyes, then it's not much of a jump to understand that it's not fair to treat people differently because of the color of their skin. So even talking to kids that young, I can usually get through to them. I can usually get them to understand. All right, so with that, I'll get going. So again, this is a picture of my dad. This was about, well, Dad was born in 1931. So this would have been about 1937 when he was 6 years old. Started first grade, and Dad and he had one brother and several other neighbors who were also Black children, and they had to walk to school. I measured the distance one time in my car from where he used to live back when he was this age, and then where the only Black school in Huntsville was. It was about 6 or 6.5 miles. You know, I think depending on which route you took and whether you cut through some fields and so forth, it was about 6.5 miles. Now, it wasn't that there were no school buses. There were school buses that ran right along that same route, but Black children were not allowed to ride on the school buses. And to make matters worse, the white children who were on the school buses would spit out the windows of the bus or throw things out the windows of the bus at the Black children who were walking along on that sometimes dusty road down here in Alabama. And even worse than that, that said that the bus driver, when they got near a group of Black children, the bus driver would slow down so that the white children on the bus could aim better at the Black children with whatever they were trying to do or trying to hit them with. But you know, that was the environment that he grew up in. Now, this is a picture of my dad when he was about 14, and he looks about 10 to me, but he says he was about 14, and he said, I should say, he said he knew that he was about 14 because the young lady who's kneeling right behind him, that was my dad's first girlfriend, and he was her first boyfriend. And a little side story, I put this picture on Facebook some time ago, and a young lady who grew up here in Huntsville but now lives out in Colorado said, I think that's a picture of my mom when she was a girl. And she said, I don't have any pictures of her at that age. And so I went and asked my dad, and he told me the lady's name. And sure enough, that was that young lady's mother. So she was able to get a picture of her mom that she had never seen before. But anyway, so again, at this age, Dad was still in public school, of course, here in Huntsville, still walking to school. The school that he went to was somewhat poorly equipped. It had, there was no playground, there was no cafeteria at the school, there was no library at the school. This was the all-Black school in Huntsville, Alabama. He said they had a few books, but they didn't even have enough books to have what you could consider to be a library. So that was those were the conditions that he had to go to school under. And furthermore, where the school was in Huntsville, the Black school, it was surrounded on 3 sides by the city dump, the Huntsville city dump. So you can imagine that, and you know that they didn't have air conditioning back in those days, and even if they had, the Black school would not have had air conditioning. So of course, so many of the school months, it's very hot here in Alabama. So you've got to open the windows to try to cool it down a little bit. So you can imagine what that was like. Let me fast forward here a little bit. So Dad wanted to be a doctor, as you can see. Now this picture is from the early 60s, I believe, but he knew even in high school that he wanted to be a doctor. His school wasn't properly equipped to teach him chemistry. They didn't have a chemistry lab in high school, nothing like that. And so he mail ordered a chemistry set to teach himself chemistry. And that was how he learned enough to pave the road for him to become a doctor. Excuse me. But I'll have to take a break. My mouth gets dry and I have to get some water. But anyway, so when it came time for him to think about undergraduate school, he applied to the University of Alabama and to Auburn University. Now, this would have been the late 40s, and there were no Black people going to the University of Alabama or Auburn or any of the what are now the SEC schools. There were no Black people going. But Dad applied because by applying, they would send him a catalog. And once he got a catalog to those two schools, he could see what kinds of classes he needed to take for a pre-med curriculum. So he got the catalogs. He had to go to the local Black college here, Alabama A&M College, it was called. It's now called Alabama A&M University. But he focused on the classes that he needed as a pre-med curriculum, and did so well in undergrad that he was actually accepted into medical school after 2 years of undergrad. At the end of his second year of undergrad, he was accepted. Couldn't go to medical school anywhere in the state of Alabama, but he went to Meharry Medical College in Nashville, Tennessee. And that's where he actually got his bachelor's degree, his master's degree, and his PhD all at the same time, because he had basically skipped the last 2 years of undergraduate school and had gone on to Meharry. Now let's see if I want to. Okay, now this is a picture of my mom when Mom and Dad got engaged, and I put this picture in here again just to kind of talk about the way things were here in Huntsville, Alabama, in the late 50s and the early 60s. Mom wanted to get, or Mom and Dad wanted to get her engagement picture put in the Huntsville Times. That was our local newspaper at that time. And Dad went down to the newspaper office, and to the building, and he said, you know, he took the picture with him, and he asked if they would put it in the newspaper. Well, the person he talked to down there, he said, Dr. Herford, do you know you are asking me to destroy the society page of the Huntsville Times? He said, if I put your fiance's picture in there, he said, no white couple will ever put their pictures in there again. And so Dad was not able to get her picture put into the Huntsville Times. But that, again, that just sort of gives you an idea. Now, as Harry Carey used to say, honesty compels me to report that the fellow at the Huntsville Times told him, he said, Doc, if you will bring me a newspaper from Birmingham or Atlanta or Memphis or even from New York that shows a page that has Black fiancés and white fiancés on the same page, he says, I will put her picture in there. And Dad said, no matter, he said he couldn't remember how much money he spent on newspapers, but he could not find one. Even the northern newspapers at that time would not put Black fiancés' pictures in the newspaper. But again, just to give you an idea of how things were here at that time. The public facilities, like at the courthouse. Someone once told me this picture was from the courthouse, the Madison County Courthouse here where Huntsville is. I've not verified that, but it could well be. As you can see, separate water fountains. The people here felt like no white person wanted to drink out of a water fountain after a Black person had drunk from that water fountain. So you could see what the setup was. When you went to places to shop, a lot of them didn't even have restrooms for the Black people. And sometimes places would have white men, white women, colored men, and colored women. And some other places would have white men, white women, and colored. And if you were colored, men and women shared the same restroom. But again, just to give you an idea of how things were down here. Now, as you can imagine, there were a lot of people, and I'm leaving out some of the details, but as you can imagine, there were a lot of people down here who weren't happy about things as we got into the 60s. And so this is just an example. And by the way, this picture is kind of fuzzy because I snagged it from a video I was about to do. But this was one of the poster walks that we had in downtown Huntsville. This would have been probably 61 or 62, something like that. But we had all kinds of demonstrations, all kinds of protests. We had sit-ins at the lunch counters down here because most of the stores, the department stores and the drug stores had lunch counters in those days. and Black people were not allowed to sit at the lunch counter. They would tell you you couldn't sit there. If you sat there anyway, they would give you one warning, and then they could call the police and have you arrested. Um, but one of the kinds of protests that some of the young Black people used to do, and I say young because a lot of the protesters were college students, some were high school students even, and some were young adults. But what they would do in a lot of cases, they'd get 5 or 6 young Black men, and they would have one white friend with them who would go into a place like Walgreens and check out the lunch counter and make sure that it was open and operating. And then he'd come back out and give them the high sign, and then 5 or 6 of them would go in there and sit down at the same time. And one thing about it is that even if they would, and they wouldn't serve those Black patrons, but they couldn't serve anybody else either because all of the seats were being taken up. But again, there were all kinds of protests. Let me go to the, there I am up in the front when I think I was 5 years old in this picture, but I was leading a procession with a sign saying youngsters like freedom too, as you can see there. But I got to participate in those things at a very early age. At one point during our civil rights movement here, Governor Wallace was here. Actually, I'm not sure he was even governor yet. He was campaigning for governor. So I'm not sure if it was his first election or re-election as governor. But anyway, one of the things that some of the civil rights protesters did was to release some balloons when Governor Wallace was here, some helium-filled balloons. And he might have thought it was some sort of a celebration for him, but it actually had messages. Each balloon had a message attached that talked about the conditions here in Huntsville, because we wanted to make sure that they knew that we were telling everybody around that we weren't happy about things here. Water break, excuse me. Okay, there were appeals to the school board to desegregate schools. And the way that that would go is we were able to get the idea of desegregation of the schools onto the school board agenda when they would have their meetings. And what they would do is make our item the last item on the agenda. They would conduct their entire meeting with several members of the civil rights community there, make ours the last on the agenda. They'd go through the entire meeting. They'd get to that last item. Somebody on the board would make a motion to adjourn. Someone else would second it. It would pass unanimously, and they would get up and walk out of the room, leaving the civil rights protesters there sitting in their seats. So, in those days, there was not much that could be done about that, because the people that wanted to see those kinds of things go on, they controlled everything. There were no Black policemen. There weren't even any Black firemen or Black bank tellers. But of course, the mayor and the entire city council were all white. Everyone on the school board was white, and there was just no one who could make them do anything differently. We appealed to the mayor, we appealed to the city council, we appealed to the school board, like I said. And after months and months of these kinds of protests, not much progress was being made. So, because the movement had lost some momentum, after months and months of trying things and sit-ins and poster walks and all kinds of protests, someone at one of the strategy meetings, the civil rights strategy meeting, someone said, well, we need to bring someone here to town who can stir things up a little bit and maybe get people enthused again, and even bring back some of the people who were in the movement and have left, and maybe even bring some other people into the movement. So at one of the meetings, Dr. King's name was mentioned. Now this was 1962, and Dr. King was not as famous in 1962 as he came to be before his assassination in '68, but he was still a lot more famous than anybody here in Huntsville. So Dr. King was brought to Huntsville in 1962, in March of '62, and he spoke at 2 main places that he spoke. At the First Baptist Church, the Black First Baptist Church here in Huntsville. And then he spoke at Oakwood College, which was the other Black college that we had here in Huntsville. So, and this is kind of a blurry picture because I had gotten this a long time ago from a program from that Oakwood visit, that Oakwood speech that he gave. And I just wanted to keep that for posterity. I wanted to keep that picture. Obviously, I could get a much better picture these days. But that was very important that Dr. King came here because it attracted a lot of attention, at least regional attention and probably some national attention. But again, he was much better known than anybody who was here. And when Dr. King was here, he had three main topics that he talked about. He said nonviolence. He said the movement has to be nonviolent. If people are getting hurt and property is getting destroyed, your movement will get squashed, and it won't matter who's right and who's wrong. So we have to keep the movement nonviolent. So one of the things that was done, now I mentioned that there were a lot of young people, and of course a lot of young males, college age, high school age. Well, young men, when they're in high school and college, are probably at their physical prime. And some of those guys wanted to fight. When they would go out marching and so forth, they were looking for a fight. So a lot of times, some of the most hot-headed of the protesters would be given jobs like making signs back at the warehouse rather than being out on the front lines, because we knew we had to keep the movement nonviolent. The other thing Dr. King talked about, another thing, was voter registration. Well, back in those days here in Madison County, if you wanted to register to vote, and you have to realize a lot of Black people didn't even have enough hope to even try to vote. But if you wanted to try to register to vote, first of all, you had to get someone who was already a registered voter to take you down there to vouch for you, as they said, vouch for you. And then the other thing is that the examiner would give you a portion of the United States Constitution, and you had to interpret that portion of the Constitution to the satisfaction of the examiner. So you can imagine how that often went. Very difficult to do. But the other thing Dr. King talked about was school desegregation. And I've never heard this from him, but I feel like he probably felt that if we could get children together, if we could get the schools integrated, and children could be around other young children at a very early age, that would give them a chance to see that, children are just children, people are just people. And it's much easier, I think, to introduce that at 6 years old or 7 years old than it is in high school or even beyond that. But those were the things that he talked about. My family has audio of his speech that he gave at Oakwood College, and there are a lot of elements of the I Have a Dream speech, which was given a little over a year later at the March on Washington in 1963. But a lot of the elements in the I Have a Dream speech we heard here first in Huntsville back in 1962, which probably shouldn't surprise you because a lot of the issues had not changed in 1 year, or a little over a year. A lot of the issues had not changed. So a lot of the things that you might have heard him say in the I Have a Dream speech, like I said, we heard it here first. Now, this is a picture of my dad, obviously on the left, and Dr. King on the right. When Dr. King came here, we had a much smaller airport in Huntsville and in a different location, but much smaller. And there were dozens of people there from the civil rights movement, dozens of people to meet Dr. King. Well, my father got the privilege of escorting Dr. King to his speaking engagements. And the way my dad told the story, after everybody met Dr. King and, a lot of handshaking and so on, they asked Dr. King who he wanted to ride with. Well, he looked out in the parking lot and he saw a convertible Cadillac. Well, that car happened to belong to my dad, and so my dad had the honor and privilege of escorting him to his speaking engagement. Now, another thing about Dr. King's visit, there was only one Black-owned motel in Huntsville, and apparently it was decided that that would not be safe for him to stay at that hotel because the Klan was active here at that time. And as they still are, I hear occasionally, but the Klan was active here. And I suspect that if they wanted to start some trouble, that would have been the first place that they would have looked. So Dr. King actually stayed at the home of a minister here in Huntsville, one of the other civil rights leaders by the name of Reverend Ezekiel Bell, in one of the Black communities in Huntsville that was out near Alabama A&M College. But Dr. King stayed at his home. And of course, it was kept a secret where he was going to be staying. Now, a lot of the black men in town at that time were hunters, and so a lot of them had rifles and shotguns, and they kept watch the whole night. I think actually it was a couple of nights that Dr. King was here, but they kept watch the whole time to make sure, and there was no trouble, and apparently the secret was well kept. But as Reverend Bell told me years later, if there had been any trouble, they were well prepared, was what he told me. Okay, so even after Dr. King's visit, we made some progress with civil rights, but this is another picture that I snagged from video. One of the protests or boycotts that was conducted here was called Blue Jean Sunday. And this would have been Easter, I forget what, Easter, it's 62, I think this was Easter of 62. But in those days, and even today, a lot of the folks who went to the black churches really liked to dress up, and especially on Easter Sunday. The men bought new suits for Easter. The women bought fancy dresses, you know, and new shoes and so on for Easter. But they came up with a boycott. They said, we're not going to buy. We're going to wait until all of the merchants have stocked up with these new suits and these dresses and so forth, and then we're not going to buy them. We're not going to go and buy those things. We're just going to wear blue jeans to church for Easter Sunday. And further, now some of the women, it wasn't always fashionable for women to wear jeans, to wear pants at all. So some of the women who didn't want to wear blue jeans bought denim and just made skirts, made denim skirts. And so what you're seeing here, and I know it's not real clear, but you see several of the men and several of the women in their denim or blue jean outfits. And furthermore, they didn't even buy the jeans or the denim here in Huntsville. They went outside of Huntsville to some other cities, Decatur, Alabama, Athens, Alabama, Fayetteville, Tennessee. They went to other places to buy that stuff. So they felt like they really hurt the merchants and got their attention. And sure enough, with each step, with each of these things that went on, with Dr. King's visit, with Blue Jean Sunday, each time a little bit more progress was made. Okay, so it came time to work on integrating the schools. And just a little backstory to this document. A couple of years ago, I spoke at the Rotary Club here in Huntsville. And the gentleman who was chairing the meeting that day was a retired lawyer by the name of Rankin Sneed. And after I spoke, he presented me with this document. I had never seen it before. But as it happened, Rankin Sneed, who by the way is a good liberal Democrat, and Rankin's father, Arnold Sneed, if you can see, let me see if I can move my cursor to there, if you can see that name, Arnold Sneed was the chairman of the Huntsville Board of Education. Well, in 1963, he was presented with this subpoena. And without me going through it all, when Rankin presented this to me, he said, basically what it says is, come down here to federal court in Birmingham on this date at this time, bring these documents with you going back this far, because you got some splaining to do. Because basically what happened was all of these months of us appealing to the school board and trying to get them to desegregate the schools had made almost no progress. And so we filed, my father filed a lawsuit in federal court, and this was the subpoena that came out of that, and this was the beginning of school desegregation. I talked to someone who knew some of the people from Huntsville City Schools who went down there to Birmingham for that meeting, and they said basically the lawyers just ate them up. They had nothing. And I like to talk about this because you have to remember Brown versus the Board of Education in Topeka, Kansas, which was a Supreme Court decision, so it was a federal decision, but that struck down separate but equal in 1954. So Brown versus Board of Education was 9 years old when we brought this lawsuit, and yet there had been no movement in Alabama. As you can imagine, people in Alabama, and in fact in most places in the South, didn't run to get in line with Brown versus the Board of Education. But this was the subpoena that started it all out. Now, it was an interesting court case down there. The lawyers for the city of Huntsville had let me say this first. When the lawsuit was first brought, there were 35 Black families in Huntsville that said they wanted their children to be part of this lawsuit. 35 families. By the time the case was decided, we were down to 4 families. Because in 1963, if you were Black in Huntsville, Alabama, you almost certainly worked for someone who was white. And they didn't see us as freedom fighters. They usually saw us as troublemakers. And so through threats and intimidation, and when I say threats, I mean in some cases physical threats, and in some cases threats of a loss of a job or something like that, we went from 35 families down to 4 families, 4 children. Now, the lawyers for the city of Huntsville had a 4-point argument why I should not be able to go to the all-white school that was about a block and a half from my house. The all-Black school was about a mile and a half from my house, but the all-white school was a block and a half or so at the time this lawsuit was presented. So their 4-point argument, now again, remember, Brown versus Board is 9 years old. I like to say they were arguing uphill, but this was the best they could do. The first point, they said, such a thing had never been done before. So as you can imagine, the judge dismissed that out of hand. Their second point, they said there was such a wide street that I would have to cross to get from my house to where the school was. And they were talking about, for those of you familiar with Huntsville, Governor's Drive was the street. It wasn't nearly as wide back then as it is now, but it was still one of the busiest streets in Huntsville. But when they presented that point, that there was such a wide street, let me just say, I'm glad they were concerned for my safety. The judge asked them, he said, now, are there white children that have to cross that street? Yes. Are there crossing guards to help those white children cross the street? Yes. Can't those same crossing guards help him to cross the street? Well, they had lost that point. Their third point, they said that if they let this one little Negro boy into the school, it would disrupt their entire school system. And the judge, as my father explained it, the judge leaned forward and he said, you mean to tell me you have such poor control over your school system that this one little Negro boy could disrupt your entire school system? Well, there's no good answer to that. You can't say yes and you can't say no. So they had lost that one. And then their fourth and final point that these high-paid lawyers had, their fourth and final point, was that they had turned Montgomery upside down and could not find a copy of my birth certificate. So if you think that the first time that was tried was on Barack Obama, you'd be wrong. They practiced that on me back in 1963. So you can imagine that their lawyers were more than a little embarrassed when our lawyers explained to them that I was born in East Chicago, Indiana, so they needed to be looking in Indianapolis for my birth certificate. But that was the best they had. Those were their 4 points why they should not let me or the other 3 Black children into the school. So, and one other thing I mentioned, like I said, in 1963, if you were Black, you almost certainly worked for someone who was white. My father was a doctor, had his own practice. One of the other young men, his father was a minister and had his own church. The young lady in the group, there was one young lady among the 4 of us, her mother was a beautician and owned her own beauty shop. So those 3 didn't really have anyone to answer to. Now, the other young man, John Bruton was his name. I don't remember, or I don't know what his parents did back then. But at least for the 3 of the 4 of us, we were in a situation where jobs could not be threatened. And so that's one way of explaining why we stayed with it. We all stayed with it, while 31 other families fell by the wayside. Okay, now, and by the way, the judge, after hearing the case, did not even retire to deliberate. He ruled from the bench, and his decision was, admit these 4 students immediately, and by January 1st, well, some people said January 2nd, he said, I want a plan on my desk for the desegregation of all Huntsville City and all Madison County schools. Okay, so that decision was handed down in, I believe it was August, mid or late August of 1963. And see, back in those days, here in Alabama, school always started the Tuesday after Labor Day. In that particular year, 63, Labor Day was on September 2nd, and so school was to have started September 3rd that year. So the reason I have this picture in here, this was the Unitarian Universalist Church in Huntsville in 1963. The sign out front says, "We are in mourning for the slain children of Birmingham." So the Unitarians have always supported the civil rights movement, at least ever since I've known anything about the Unitarians. Let me put it that way. They've always supported the civil rights movement as a church. And here in Huntsville, they were the only predominantly white church that supported the civil rights movement as a church. We had individuals from some of the other churches, but the only church that supported the movement as a church was the Unitarian Church. The other reason I have this picture here is because once the court case was decided, the Unitarians had a little preschool for the 4 Black children and for some number, I don't remember, of white children, to have a preschool, kind of a kindergarten, because in those days, kindergarten was not required as it is today. But they had kind of a little week-long kindergarten so that the Black children and white children could get used to going to school together, because that had never been done in the history of the state of Alabama. So, and by the way, this structure is long since the Unitarian Church moved out of this to another facility and then to a different one. But this is now a private residence, but it's still standing and still pretty much looks like this on Clinton Avenue here in Huntsville. Let's see. Viola Liuzzo, or Liuzzo, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, Liuzzo, I'll assume. But she was a Unitarian who lived in Detroit, Michigan. And back during the Selma, back during the activity in Selma, she was a homemaker and I believe a mother of 5, and drove from Detroit down to Selma to help with the civil rights movement. I think I said, but yes, she was a Unitarian Universalist, but was compelled to come down and help. Unfortunately, she was murdered by the Klan. She was shot to death from some Klan members in a car, in an automobile. And the reason that they know exactly who did it is because there was an FBI informant in the car. And I've often thought, well, you know, if he was in the car, maybe he could have stopped the shooting, but I can only think that if he had done that, that might have blown his cover. So, but anyway, she was one of many Unitarians who gave their lives for the civil rights movement. And this was September 3rd, 1963. This was the day that I should have started school. And this picture has been in the newspapers in Huntsville and used on TV shows. And 95% of the people who see it think this was my first day of school. But actually what happened was that Governor Wallace, George Wallace, kept the 4 schools in Huntsville, he kept them closed, the ones that were going to integrate. Like I said, there were 4 students and we were all going to different schools. He kept those schools closed for that Tuesday, September 3rd, and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday. And so, and on Friday, he actually had his state troopers come up and make sure that no one entered. And Black children couldn't go to school. White children couldn't go to those schools either. And I guess Wallace's thinking was that if I don't let anybody go to school, then nobody can accuse me of discriminating. And so he just kept those schools closed. But this picture was given to my dad many years ago, of course, and sent anonymously through the mail. Dad wasn't even sure who sent it to us. But we've had this picture for a few decades. Oh, and this is just, this is something for my Huntsville crowd usually. I went back to that spot, probably 6 or 8 years ago, and tried to stand in about the same place and point my camera in about the same direction, just to show how much that area has changed. And the picture in the upper left, you can't see too much because of all of the traffic, but the picture in the upper right is, like I said, from about that same place with the camera in about that same direction. The only thing that's still the same, and again, this would have been about 50 years later, but the only thing that's still the same is that Bragg's of Huntsville is still there and still in business, by the way. But everything else is different, including Governor's Drive itself has been widened now. This is a copy of the telegram that my father sent to our lawyers down in Birmingham on September 6th. That would have been that Friday, the fourth day that Governor Wallace had kept the schools closed. And he says, took my son to Fifth Avenue School, 845. A sergeant of the Highway Patrol met me, said school is closed by Governor Wallace's orders. And the state troopers were extremely polite. This was nothing like the scenes that you may have seen from Selma or from Birmingham with the police dogs and the fire hoses. They were very polite. They were firm. And it made sure we understood nobody was getting in, but they were very polite. So we didn't have any such incident here in Huntsville, and that was by design. We knew that things had to be kept nonviolent here. And this is September 9th, 1963, the following Monday. And Governor Wallace finally relented. And there's some speculation as to exactly what happened. He may have just seen the writing on the wall and known that it was just a matter of time. I've heard rumors that some of the local merchants in Huntsville put some pressure on him because they wanted to see peace and harmony here. I've heard that some people at Redstone Arsenal here, we have an Army base here, which also houses George C. Marshall Space Flight Center, a major NASA center here. And I've heard that some of the executives from NASA and from the Army put some pressure on him because Huntsville had in those days and still has a lot of federal contracts. And if there were a lot of discord here, a lot of those federal contracts could go to other places around the country. So I don't know for sure, but I suspect that there was probably some combination of all of those things. Wallace seeing that, you know, the end was near and getting some pressure from city officials and from some of the Redstone Arsenal and NASA officials. But again, this was September 9th, 1963. And like I said, when I speak to the youngsters, you know, I explain to them that just a couple of minutes after this picture was taken, history was made because I was registered for school. And that was the first time in the state of Alabama that a Black child had been registered to go to a previously all-white school. Now, like I said, there were 4 of us in all, and there were actually federal marshals here from Washington, D.C. to protect us going to school. And those marshals dressed in plain clothes and stood out around the crowds. There were crowds who were yelling things at us, as you might imagine, as we walked up there. But the marshals spread out among the crowd in plain clothes so that if there were any trouble, they wouldn't be like up on the steps and have to go down and take care of it. They'd be right down there among the people who were protesting, you know, my entrance into the school. We actually staggered the integrations on that day so that those federal marshals could go from school to school to school to school. And I was allowed to go first because it was my family, my father, who had brought the lawsuit. So that was how I came to be first among the 4 on that day. And of course, Huntsville was the first city in the state of Alabama to integrate the public schools. This is a copy of the Huntsville Times the following day. State bars Negroes elsewhere, Huntsville quietly integrates. And then you can see down below where it says Mobile, Birmingham, and Tuskegee were 3 other cities that were trying to integrate, and they were turned away, even on this day, even on this Monday, September 9th, when Huntsville integrated. Those other cities in Alabama did not integrate. And that is a picture of the Honorable Governor George C. Wallace of the sovereign state of Alabama, holding a Birmingham News. And if you can't read that headline, it says Huntsville defies Wallace. And I've often wondered why he allowed that picture to be taken and then to be circulated. And I'm probably giving him too much credit. But for those of you who don't know much about Governor Wallace, he did not start his political career as a racist. He started out running on economic matters. But what happened, as I understand it, the first race that he ran against a staunch segregationist, and Wallace lost. And the quote that he made, where he said, "I'll never be out-niggered again." And so from that point on, of course, Wallace is probably one of the most infamous racists in the history of our country. Oh, and that's just a small picture of Fifth Avenue School. That's what the school looked like back in 1963. The building is no longer there. Now there's, again, for those of you who might know Huntsville, the Spine and Neuro Center is on that property now at the corner of, at the southwest corner of Governors and Gallatin. The Spine and Neuro Center is on that exact property where the school used to be. And there I am in my first grade class. When I speak to the kids, I like to have fun and say, "Can you find me in this picture?" You know, and usually I'll point to 2 or 3 of the other kids, and they'll go, "No," and then of course, they find me right away in that picture. There I am in my second grade class. I went to this school, Fifth Avenue School, for 2 years, and after that, I started third grade at a private Catholic school here in Huntsville. But it was called St. Joseph's then. It's now called Holy Family. It merged with St. Mary's School at one point, I think around 1990 or so, and now it's Holy Family School. But I have kind of a funny story about this picture that I'll tell you a little bit later. So in fifth grade, one day the teacher passed out these forms that we were to take home and get filled out by our parents and signed and then brought back. And I wanted to be a Cub Scout, so I took my form home. My dad signed it, filled it out, and signed it. I brought it back. A few days later, my dad got a call from the Scoutmaster. He said, "Dr. Herford," he said, "your son can't join the Cub Scouts here, and I need you to explain to him why." And my dad said, "I don't think I can explain that to him." But Dad said, "I'll bring him to your office anytime you want, and you can explain it to him." Well, I want you to know that the Scoutmaster did not take my dad up on the offer. Instead, they disbanded the Cub Scouts at Fifth Avenue School. And I don't know for how long. I know it wasn't there the 2 years that I was there. And I know it was reconstituted at some point later because some of my Facebook friends who also went to Fifth Avenue School a few years after I did, told me that they were in the Cub Scout troop there. So I don't know how long the troop was disbanded, but I know that I was not allowed to join. And that's part of the reason I never became a Cub Scout or a Boy Scout for that matter after that incident. Okay, let me pause for water here. Okay, now I usually have to, well, when I show this picture, everybody knows who that is on the right. I usually have to explain to people who that is on the left. But with this crowd, I probably don't have to tell you that that is Father Theodore Hesburgh, who of course was president for 35 years, I believe it was, at Notre Dame. And he was the president the whole time that I was there. But back in 1974, the spring of 74, when I was a junior at my high school, Butler High School, like I said, it was the spring of 74, my junior year, I was already the president-elect of the student body for the following year. Well, in the spring of 74, the NAACP held a celebration in New York City. It was the 15th anniversary. Let's see. I'm sorry, the 20th. It was the 20th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education. And they had a celebration in New York City. I had the opportunity to be on a panel discussion at that NAACP celebration. I was also on the Today Show, and I was interviewed by Edwin Newman. Some of you who are closer to my age might remember Edwin Newman on the Today Show, NBC News. He asked me, we talked a little bit about my high school experience and my younger experiences, and he asked me where I wanted to go to college. And I said, Notre Dame. I got a chance to tell the whole world, whoever was watching, I wanted to go to Notre Dame. Well, a week or two later, I got a letter from Father Hesburgh inviting me to apply to Notre Dame. And so I felt like the skids were sufficiently greased. I really didn't have any concept of how hard it was to get into Notre Dame, but I will tell you that's the only place I applied. So if I hadn't gotten in, I'm not sure what I would have done. But like I said, I felt like the skids were greased. So I've always appreciated that. And by the way, one day out on the Central Quad, out in front of the administration building, we were having a Spanish class out on the quad. And of course, Father Hesburgh spoke, I think, about 5 or 6 languages. I don't remember. But Spanish was one of them. And he happened to stroll by while we were having our Spanish class out sitting in the grass. And I got a chance to thank him for sending me that letter, inviting me to apply to Notre Dame. Okay, this is the historical marker that's at the site where the school used to be. Like I said, now is the Spine and Neuro Center, but it basically documents that on this site in 1963, Sonnie Hereford became the first African-American student, and then it also lists the other 3 students and the different schools that they went to. So the school was torn, the building, it hadn't been a school for some time, but the building was torn down in 2003. This marker was put up in 2004. I found out that it's not an easy thing to do to get a historical marker put up to people who are still alive. And as it was explained to me, because, you know, if I were to go on to become an axe murderer or something, then they got to go to the trouble of tearing the sign down and all that stuff. So, so they had to jump through some extra hoops to get this put up. And all 4 of us who integrated are still alive, by the way. And 3 of us had a little reunion back last, I think it was October or November, like that. But 3 of us, the 4th person couldn't make it. All of us still live here in Huntsville, except one fellow there. David Osmond lives out in Las Vegas now, but he gets back, he still has family here and he gets back, and he was part of the reunion back then. Okay, that's a picture of my mom and dad at the dedication of that historical marker. My father passed away, let's see, July was 4 years ago from cancer. The lady that you can see there over my father's right shoulder, her name is Dr. Ann Roy Moore. And again, this was back in 2004 at the dedication of that historical marker. But at that time, she was actually the superintendent of Huntsville City Schools. And so I really enjoyed her words that she said at that dedication, because she said that very clearly she is standing on the shoulders of those who first pushed those doors open. Because obviously it took pushing those doors open before she could have possibly become superintendent of Huntsville City Schools. That's a picture of my father and me at that ceremony. And I keep this in here because I like those sunglasses. A picture of my father and me about 6 years ago, sitting in his in my parents' living room. I happened to be wearing something with Notre Dame on it that day. And of course, everybody knows who that is. A lot of times when I show this picture to the children, they'll say, "Oh, did Barack Obama help you to get into school?" And I have to explain to them that I'm actually older than Barack Obama is. So, but he's another one who has talked about standing on the shoulders of those who came before. Now, again, everybody knows who that is in the middle. The gentleman over to the far right in the front, you probably recognize him. That's Congressman John Lewis. And this was 1965 in Selma. And this is only the 2nd presentation that I've given since his passing, since John Lewis's passing. And I've always been able to say he was the youngest speaker. John Lewis was the youngest speaker at the March on Washington in =63. Of course, that will always be true. But I used to be able to say he is the only surviving speaker. And I can't say that anymore, but all of the other people who spoke at the March on Washington had passed away long before John Lewis did. Now, in 2013, a few years ago, that was the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington, and Congressman Lewis and I were invited to DC to be part of the March on Washington Film Festival. And this is one of the moments from that event. And apparently I had said something that was fairly funny, because I didn't see John Lewis smile that often. But anyway, I guess I had gotten to him somehow. But this picture is one of the pictures I'm most proud of, because at this moment, I had just made a point about the Supreme Court and about them trying to weaken the Voting Rights Act. And I had something about Antonin Scalia in particular. And this is John Lewis telling the audience and me that he had been in California a week before this event and had tried to make that same point that I had just made, but he hadn't made it as well as I did. So this is one of the pictures I am the most proud of in my entire life. Now, this is that picture that I was telling you about before. Also in 2013, my father and I we reenacted our walk to school. So this picture is from 2013. That was 50 years after I had integrated the school. We reenacted the walk right down to the minute. It was 8:30 in the morning, and when my dad and I had walked to school that morning. And so at 8:30, we reenacted the walk 50 years to the minute afterward. Well, one gentleman there had a paper copy of this picture, which is my second grade picture, and handed it to my father. And first of all, the gentleman probably didn't realize this was the second grade picture. He probably had intended to have the first grade picture. But as you can see now, in that picture, the way my father is holding it, the gentleman wanted to take a picture of my father holding that picture. And because of the way my dad has his hands placed, the only face you can't see in the classroom is mine, unfortunately. But anyway, so it gave us a story to tell for all these years. Now, here in Huntsville, the city of Huntsville, going back about 5 years, actually going back a little further than that, but they have torn down some schools, they built some new schools, and they're doing some rezoning of youngsters from one area to another. And I put this up here to show, this was the final decision that the judge made back in April of 2015. And I put this up here just to show that my picture is on the front of this, I'm sorry, my name is circled there on the front of this decision, because to this day, the city of Huntsville is still under federal oversight for their schools, going back to my court case. In other words, and don't get me wrong, a lot of progress has been made, but they still haven't fulfilled all of the factors that they have to get out from under federal oversight for their school system here. So this decision, handed down only 5 years ago, a little more than that, still references my court case, going back originally to '63, and then I think it was updated sometime in the '70s or something. But going back to the original case there in 1963. This is a book that was written by a lady named Hester Bass. It's billed as a children's book, but every adult that I know who's ever read it has learned some things. Even the folks who grew up here in Huntsville have learned some things about this. One of the things in this book is that back in the 50s and 60s, most stores would let Black people shop at them. But if you tried anything on, you had to buy it. There was no way a Black person could try on any kind of clothing or even shoes with socks on. There was no way you could try on something unless you bought it. So one of the things that I saw in this book was how mothers used to have their children stand on a piece of paper, trace the outline of the child's foot or feet on that paper, and then cut it out and take that to the store. That's how they would buy shoes for the children. They would find some shoes that fit the piece of paper, and that's how they would buy the shoes, because like I said, if the children tried them on, they had to buy it. So, but anyway, I highly recommend this book, especially for youngsters. But like I said, every adult that I know who has read it, and you can read it in about 10 minutes, by the way. But every adult that I know, and it's illustrated by that gentleman, E.B. Lewis, that you see in the lower right there, his name. He did a fantastic job of this. Now, this was the program from the groundbreaking ceremony for Sonnie Hereford Elementary School here in Huntsville. It's been open since 2016 or 17, I forget. Anyway, it's been open for a few years now, but this was the program from that groundbreaking ceremony. And my father and I had talked about it, and there was limited time for speeches, and a lot of different people wanted to speak at the groundbreaking, and again at the ribbon cutting a year and a half later. But we had decided that Dad would speak at the groundbreaking and that I would speak at the ribbon cutting. And it's a good thing that we decided to do it that way, because Dad passed away about 2 weeks before the ribbon cutting. But he was here for the groundbreaking. And this is an artist rendition of the school. It's a beautiful school, very modern. Doesn't have to be retrofitted with a lot of the things like many of the older school buildings these days. And this is my dad and me and half of my mom. at the groundbreaking ceremony. And this is my dad speaking at that groundbreaking ceremony. One of the things that he said that, now let me get this right. He said, other than the day he was married and the birth of his children, that this was the proudest day of his life. And I'm pretty sure he just said that first part because he felt like he had to. And I'm pretty sure this was actually the proudest day of his life. And one of the things he said was, he said, they used to call me names and spit at me and throw things at me. He said, now they name schools after me, you know. So indeed, that was a very proud day for our whole family. So let's see, I think, so I'm kind of wrapping up here, but one of the efforts that I'm involved in now, as is my older daughter, Beth, Beth, who, by the way, is a professor at Syracuse University. She's home right now because she's teaching remotely. She and I are involved in this effort here in Huntsville called Rocket City Civil Rights. And so I just wanted to call this to your attention. If you see on the right side, halfway down, www.rocketcitycivilrights.org. If you'll go there, you'll get to see a lot of the pictures and even some video of interviews that we've had, mostly with people who fought the battles back in the early 60s. This effort is designed to try to capture as much of that as we can because that was so many years ago, so many decades ago, that every year we're losing more and more of the people who were on the front lines of that battle. And so if you're interested, rocketcitycivilrights.org. And by the way, our website some of it is there. It's still under construction. So we're in the process of expanding it quite a bit, but there's enough there to kind of get you started as far as seeing what kinds of things went on and what sort of risks were taken and sacrifices were made. And then finally, this picture is so old that it's still a VHS tape rather than a DVD, which has been for a long time now. But this is a video. My father had two medium-sized boxes of 8mm film that he had taken back in the 50s and 60s of the civil rights movement. And by the way, the reason he even had a video camera back in those days was because Black doctors could not go to any of the continuing ed classes here in Alabama because they were taught in the hotels. And a Black person couldn't walk into the front door of a hotel in Huntsville. You could go to the back door, the side door if you were delivering something, but you could not walk into the front door. So doctors could not do that. So my dad went to Hawaii for some continuing ed, taught, by the way, by USC. And consequently, Dad was a USC fan for his whole life. So you can imagine he and I had some fun with that. But anyway, that's why he had a video camera, because he was getting ready to go to Hawaii to take continuing ed. And he said, well, you don't go to Hawaii without a camera, movie camera. So he bought it for that and then ended up using it to capture a lot of the civil rights planning meetings and protests and marches and so forth here in Huntsville. But some of that video made its way into, about 46 minutes, I think it is, made its way into this, A Civil Rights Journey. And then get this, back in about 1998, some gentlemen in Los Angeles, Houston and Hudson, I think their names were, but they were going to do a film about the civil rights movement in Birmingham. And you can see that one. It's called Mighty Times, the Children's March. Well, they did some poking around, those gentlemen from Hollywood, and heard that my father had some video. And so they wanted to use some of his video, even though it was from here in Huntsville, not Birmingham. A lot of the scenes you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. So their video won an Academy Award in, I forget, it was the early 2000s. I'm going to say 2003 or 4, something like that. But Mighty Times, A Children's March, won an Academy Award, and actually has 20 clips of my dad's footage to kind of pad out that video, to tell the story of that video. For example, there's one scene where they show Dr. King arriving, because he did go to Birmingham back at that time. And the arrival is actually him arriving here in Huntsville. But, 99.5% of the people would know that that was Huntsville and not Birmingham. So that was used. So we got a chance to go down to Birmingham to celebrate the Academy Award, and we all got to have pictures taken with the Oscar and so on. But anyway, so that's pretty much what I wanted to tell. Let's see, I think, yeah, that's actually the last video. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. I do have a couple of more things to say, but that's the last of the video to show. So let's see here. Whoops. No, not that one. There you go. Okay. Okay. So the last couple of things I want to say. Like I said, I do a lot of presentations to the children, and most times they get it. Like I said, when I break it down to terms that they understand real well, most times they get it, but not always. And this one time after I'd spoken at the Montessori school, there was a young lady who said, and she couldn't have been, she was 5 or 6, I'm sure. And she said to me, she said, you know, in our family, we have a black dog and a white dog. And when we take our dogs to the vet, he treats them both just the same. And that has always meant a lot to me because I knew that she got it, you know, she got the message. And then the other thing I'll say, there was one young man who I think was in the 3rd grade when I spoke to him, when I spoke to his group at Montessori school. And when he got to be about 5 years later, when he was in the 8th grade, his mom called me and asked if he could interview me for a school project. And I said, sure. So she brought him down to where I worked and we found a conference room. And she said, ask him what he wants to be. Well, he wants to be, when he grows up, he wants to be a civil rights lawyer. So.
Wow.
So that's it. You know, what can we do today? I think we have a lot of opportunities today. So many things have happened just in the last few months that, and without me going into details, but with the George Floyd murder, I'll call it murder, in Minnesota, I think a lot of things I think have changed. We've seen that be a pivot point, I think, for a lot of things, even though there were a lot of similar incidents before that, but this seemed to be the one that got the attention of the whole country and indeed the whole world. I mean, when I saw people in Trafalgar Square, you know, protesting and the signs that they had and so forth, it let me know that, you know, it's like the whole world gets it now. And we've been trying to say this for a long time, but the whole world gets it now. Going back to 1974, when I was, 74, 75, that school year, I was president of the student body at Butler High School. We were the Butler Rebels. We had a huge Confederate flag at one end of our gym. One of our gym walls was covered with a Confederate flag. And I tried to explain to people that that was a problem for some of the people there. And they said, well, you know, and Butler, by the way, was only about 15% black at that time. And I would try to explain to them what a problem that was. And they said, well, that's our heritage. You know, that's our heritage. I said, yeah, that's your heritage from when the school was segregated, you know. And some people heard it, most people did not. But we have been fighting these wars for a long time. I should say fighting these battles. You know, it's one big war that's not over yet. But we've been fighting these battles for decades. But maybe getting a little bit more traction now. So with that, I'm probably over time. Why don't I stop there and we'll go to questions and answers. That's okay.
Wow, thank you so much, Sonny. That was an incredible presentation. Thank you for being here to tell your story. What an honor it is to have you with us. It's really incredible. I mean, you know, you were 6 years old, right? That when
I started, yeah, I just, my birthday is August 30th. I got into school September 9th. So I had just turned 6.
So as a 6-year-old, to have that courage to go into that school, and you mentioned walking in, being that scene that we can imagine because we've seen it in movies where the people were lined up on either side and yelling and so your courage is such an inspiration to me. I thank you. My children thank you. My children, we all stand upon your shoulders. So we all owe you a debt for you and your family's bravery. So, just thank you for being here to tell your story.
Thank you.
Sure, sure. And let me tell one little story of talking about courage. I'm really glad that I was 6 years old and too young to understand how the world can be. Because I think if I had been high school age, I probably would have been terrified. But to give you one example of something that happened in first grade, cafeteria, trays up on a stack. You take your tray off the stack, slide it along the rail in the cafeteria. There was a little girl, a little white girl. I was the only black person in the school. And she couldn't get her tray down off the stack. And I got her tray down for her. I went to hand it to her. And she goes, "Oh no, my mother told me never to take anything from a nigger." Just like that. Well, as you can imagine, that could have been a really ugly incident. But what I learned from that, even at 6 years old, I realized she didn't even know what she was saying to me. That was her mother speaking through her. And so I've always carried that lesson with me. That children that age, they don't know that they're not supposed to like people who don't look like
Gotcha. Carrie wants to make an announcement, by the way. So,
Well, Sonny, thank you so much for, I don't even know what to say, but thank you so much. It was just such an incredible presentation. And I loved your Notre Dame story. That was, you were saving that from us, and that was incredible. But I just want to let you know that on behalf of the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh, we're going to be making a donation to the Rocket City Civil Rights Group.
Wonderful.
So, yeah. So I'll find it on the World Wide Web, and we'll be sure to support that cause for sure.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. And well, if you go to the RCCR or RocketCityCivilRights.org, there's an address there.
Cool.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, definitely.
So we have a bunch of questions here. We have some wonderful comments that thanking you for the presentation. We have a couple people who are very interested in understanding how were you treated by the students and the teachers at Fifth Avenue School.
Excellent question. Because I skipped over one of those stories, but in second grade, one time out on the playground, there was a little boy out there. I'll never forget it. His name was Roger. And Roger was calling me names and all kinds of things. And, I've never had a quick temper, so that didn't bother me too much. And then Roger threw some dirt on me, and that was more than I could take. So we got into it, and I got Roger down on the ground on his back, and I'm sitting on his chest and just taking hands full of dirt and just putting it all over the best I could, And I'm not proud of that, but that's what happened, all right? And so, of course, the lady who was watching the playground comes in there and drags us into the principal's office. And we get to the principal, and I was the one who got in trouble for that incident. I told the story exactly like it happened, that he was the one who threw dirt on me first. Well, I got in trouble, and the principal said, and Roger didn't, by the way, but she said the reason I got in trouble was because of the amount of dirt that Roger had on him. So
Wow.
as I like to tell people, years later, Ronald Reagan had the term something about measured response. Well, I hadn't learned the principle of a measured response back in the second grade. Yeah. But now I have to say, other than that incident, and I was never the kind to get into much trouble or anything like that. So I didn't have to go see the principal very much. But I don't recall that my teachers ever made any difference between me and the other students. I was very smart. I was always raising my hand to answer the questions. I was a very good athlete. So when we go to recess and play, whatever, I always did really well. And so that's really the only time I can remember having a major problem with one of the students or seeing a principal who, I didn't feel like I was treated fairly by the principal on that occasion. But by and by, it was not a bad experience. Again, we were first and second graders, and most of them hadn't yet been taught that they weren't supposed to like me.
Wow. Gotcha. Okay. Another question. Did you ever regret all the attention?
No, and actually, I didn't get a lot of attention growing up. It wasn't something that I went around talking about a lot. Now, people who knew and asked me questions, I'd talk to them about it. But and I didn't start doing presentations until probably, oh, maybe we'll say I'm almost 63, maybe about 25 years ago. I started doing presentations about this, but. It wasn't a big deal. I didn't make a big deal about it all through school. Some people knew about it, but I didn't make a big deal about it. So there wasn't a whole lot of it.
And we actually have a Pittsburgh question.
Okay.
So besides the game and going to and watching Notre Dame beat Pitt,
Yes.
did you get to see any sights when you were in Pittsburgh?
Let's see. I got to see the Three Rivers, and let's see. I think the game might have been in Three Rivers Stadium. In fact, I'm going back a long ways, obviously. So, actually, I can't remember if it was on the Pitt campus or at Three Rivers Stadium back then. But I remember we got to stay in a beautiful high-rise apartment. We knew someone who lived in a very nice high-rise apartment, so we got to stay there. Had a beautiful view of the city and the rivers and the bridges and everything. So, but other than that, I think it was basically make our way back to South Bend.
Gotcha. Well, one of the things that you spoke about, the pressure from the businesses and city officials, right, from the base that's in Huntsville, as well as George Wallace being a pro-business candidate and losing to a segregationist,
Yeah.
and then him changing, I guess the way that he marketed himself as a candidate for the next election. It really speaks to how I feel the systemic racism, right? The systemic nature, because so much of the racist tendencies is steeped in business, right? Going back to the 1600s, right? It really is along those lines. And did you, I would say this, did your father and the other civil rights leaders, did they see it as that as well, or was it much more in the action-oriented type of things?
Okay, that's a very good question. And the former, they understood. Like I said, I didn't go into a lot of the detail because of time, but there were a number of things that they did to put pressure on people economically here. Number of boycotts. They sent people up to boycott at the New York Stock Exchange, but representing Huntsville. They sent people, basically said, don't do business in Huntsville, Alabama. And we made sure that the leaders around here found out that they were doing that. Later, they went to the Midwest Stock Exchange in Chicago with the same sort of message, if you could see my dad's video, Dr. John Cashin, who was a local dentist, but he talks a good bit more about some of the economic pressure that they brought on the people here. So yes, a number of things were done because they knew that was, they could get some leverage there. The federal contracts, like again, NASA and DOD, federal contracts, and the other businesses in Huntsville. None of them wanted to see riots and fires and things being destroyed, so on. So yeah, they took advantage of a lot of that.
We have a question from George Porter.
I know George.
You can say hello. He's listening.
Yeah, he's one of my buddies here in the Huntsville Club, Northern
Gotcha.
Alabama Club.
Gotcha. And how was your experience as a Black student at Notre Dame? Also, how long did it take for integration to take hold in Huntsville after the 4 initial children?
Okay, so let me answer the second one first. To be honest, I don't remember. I don't even remember if there were other Black students at my school my second year. I suspect that there were, but it's like, the door had been pushed open. And so it wasn't such a big deal after that. And like I said, the judge's order had said, admit these 4 immediately. And by January 1st, I want a plan for all Huntsville City and Madison County schools. Now, that doesn't mean that they integrated immediately, starting there, but they had to have plans in place. So I suspect that it was fairly rapid after that, but it was one of those things. Not such a big deal was made of it after that first year. Not such a big deal was made. And as far as my experience at Notre Dame, I have to. I don't think I can't recall any difference ever being made between me and my fellow white students there at all. Um, I, I don't know. Maybe if you talk to some of the athletes, who were there, they might have some stories to tell you about some experiences that they had. I don't know. But I was there again from 75 to 79. And I don't recall ever having any issues associated with race at all at Notre Dame.
Gotcha. And so you didn't happen to mention this on this call, but after Notre Dame, you graduated, and what did you do for a career?
Okay, so I got a job with General Electric in Schenectady, New York, and worked there. I was on a management training program, so I spent a year in Schenectady on 2 different 6-month assignments. And then the program required that you move someplace else within GE because they wanted you to get a feel for different parts of their business. So I spent my second year in Louisville, Kentucky, still with GE. And I had liked Schenectady so much that I went back to Schenectady for about 4.5 more years. I lived up in Schenectady. So I worked my first 6.5 years out of college out of undergrad, were working for GE. And it was while I was there, my second stint, that I got my master's degree at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, which is about 12 or 15 miles from Schenectady. But I did that, and then I moved back home to Alabama, and I've worked for a few different, mostly DoD and aerospace companies here, with a couple of commercial company stints, mostly as a software engineer or a systems engineer.
Sure, and one of those companies, what's it called again? NASA, right?
Yeah. Now one of the yes, one of those agencies. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see here. We have more questions. What was Martin Luther King like in person or off camera? Do you have any insights to that?
A little bit. Now, I was only 5. In fact, I was only 4.5 when he came to Huntsville. So I don't remember a lot about it. I remember some of what my dad told me about it. But Dad said Dr. King was the most charismatic person he ever met. And the way Dad described it, the kind of person that if you were in a school gymnasium and it was shoulder to shoulder with people, and you were at one end and Dr. King entered the other end, that the second he walked in the door, you knew it. You knew that Dr. King was there. He had that kind of charisma, And but yeah, apart from that, I don't remember a lot about what he said. I know that he was fearless, and I know that he wouldn't let anything stop him from doing the things that he wanted to do, and gave his life for those things.
So moving forward.
Yeah.
Right, with today's movement, the continuation of course of the movement that your father was a big part of. What do you see as the keys to really getting everybody to move forward?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm glad you asked me that. I want to make sure that people who are listening understand that the Black Lives Matter movement, please don't think anybody means only Black Lives Matter, okay? What they're trying to say, and I've seen some good memes for this on Facebook. It's like, we say Black Lives Matter. We never said only Black Lives Matter, but we need help with Black Lives Matter because it's Black lives that are in danger, And again, I think the George Floyd thing drove this home in a way that some of the previous incidents didn't. But that's all that they're saying is Black Lives Matter, because unfortunately, in a lot of parts of our society, it doesn't seem that Black Lives Matter when you see some of the things that go on. So that's one of the things. And the other thing is that I encourage people Well, let me say this. Another thing that I've been really encouraged by in the last few months was how multiracial the movements are. I see things from around the country, and I see more other than blacks in some of the Black Lives Matter marches and so on. I see more people that are other, you know? And so I really appreciate that. And that's one of those things that lets me know that people get it. And the same way that my little story about the blue-eyed children and the brown-eyed children, you know, the way that the blue-eyed children understood that that would not be fair to their brown-eyed, you know, friends. I think all people now can see that what is happening to Black people in many of these cases is not fair. And that's why it's not just Black people who are out there marching. You know, in some previous years, if you saw a march like that, it was 90 or 95% Black. And now, you know, Blacks are in the minority in that group, you know, marching for the Black Lives Matter cause.
Yeah, the sea change is really stark in many ways. So we have another question here. Do you have a book published?
I do not. My father has a book published called Beside the Troubled Waters. Beside the Troubled Waters. And it's about the civil rights movement. It's also about his own experiences as a Black physician here in Huntsville. One of the stories, when he became a doctor here in Huntsville, there was only one other Black doctor here. They were not allowed to use the cafeteria at the hospital that they worked at, okay? There was one room at that hospital where they treated Black patients. And that was the operating room, the delivery room, and the emergency room for Black people. And he said there were times when a Black person who had had a surgery scheduled for weeks and had been prepped for surgery and was on the table for surgery would have to be taken down off the table because someone came in who had been in a car accident, or a lady came in who was about to have a baby, a Black lady, of course, about to have a baby, even though there were adjacent rooms that were empty, adjacent rooms with the same equipment, in, you know, that were empty because those rooms were for white patients only. So anyway, so he talks about a number of his experiences as a Black doctor in the South in the 50s and 60s.
Gotcha. So the name of the book is Beside the Troubled Waters?
Right, right.
Beside the Troubled Waters. We'll make sure that we'll have that as well as Mighty Times.
Right.
And a civil rights journey. We'll make sure that all of those titles, and also Seeds of Freedom. I think
Very
it's by
Very
Hester. Good. I take good notes.
by
Hester Bass.
That's
We'll make sure that all of the titles will be in the show notes when we publish this video on Vimeo. It'll be on all of our social media channels. And also RocketCityCivilRights.org. Is it RC Rocket City Civil Rights or RCCR?
Yep, spelled out, no dashes or underscores. RocketCityCivilRights.org.
All right, we'll make sure all of those links as well as the titles are in the show notes in both our video as well on our social media. So any final thoughts for us? This has been wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. Carrie and I mean, when we had our prep call, I mean, we were floored after, and we are even more floored now. It's so wonderful to be a part of this and hear your story. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. You're quite welcome. You know, I don't want the heroes to ever be forgotten. Like I said, I was only 4, 5, 6 during those times, but there were those who were older than I am, or some of them are no longer with us, but they knew how dangerous it was, and they knew what risks they were taking. And to me, those people were the heroes, including my own parents. They were the heroes, and I don't want those stories to ever be lost.
Well, that's a perfect way to end our time today. Thank you, Sonny.
Thanks, Sonny.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you to the audience for participating. This has been, I mean, just a wonderful experience to hear your story. So thank you again.
Sure thing. Yeah. Oh, and by the way, it was George Porter who put together the showing of Hesburgh for us here.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Pre-COVID, you know.
Well,
We
thank
had a
you,
wonderful
George.
show. Yep, and I spent a lot of that evening wiping tears from my eyes. I want you to know.
Yeah. Yes. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
And
Sonny. Thanks, Dan.
we have a lot of comments coming through the Q&A. Thanking you. Have a great evening, everybody. And this has been Racial and Social Justice Beyond the Dome. Thank you and good night.